Samuel Garrett stopped mid-swing of his axe, weathered hands frozen around the handle as 10 figures emerged from the mesa's shadow like ghosts materializing from his deepest regrets. For 36 winters, he'd spoken only to the wind and the memory of his dead daughter Sarah. Until now. They weren't lost travelers or wandering prospectors. They were children, girls no older than 15, their dark braids matted with dust and their feet wrapped in bloodied cloth, moving with the desperate silence of prey fleeing predators. His coffee mug slipped from the porch railing, shattering against stone as the youngest, barely 8, collapsed at his gate. The others formed a protective circle around her, hollow eyes watching him with the wariness of creatures who'd learned that adults meant pain. Sarah's old doll still sat in the window where he'd placed it 3 decades ago, its faded dress a mirror to the tattered remnants these children wore. The same age she would have been when— "Water," the eldest whispered, her voice cracked like drought-parched earth. What had driven them across 200 miles of unforgiving desert to his doorstep? And why did one of them have Sarah's eyes? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Samuel's hands trembled as he carried the collapsed girl inside, her body light as tumbleweed in his arms. The other 9 followed in silence, their bare feet whispering against the wooden floor like secrets he wasn't meant to hear. For 36 years, this cabin had echoed only with his own footsteps and the ghosts of conversations he'd never have again. He laid the youngest on Sarah's old bed, the quilt still faded from where sunlight had streamed through the window for decades. The girl's breathing was shallow, her lips cracked white from dehydration. When he turned to fetch water, he found the others arranged along the walls like sentinels, their dark eyes tracking his every movement. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked, but received only stares. The eldest, the one with Sarah's eyes, stepped forward, her chin raised with a defiance that made his chest tighten with recognition. "We ran," she said simply, her English careful and precise despite her obvious exhaustion. "From the school, from the cutting." Samuel's blood chilled. He'd heard whispers in town about the government schools, about children disappearing into those brick buildings and emerging as hollow-eyed strangers. But seeing it, these broken sparrows, who'd flown 200 miles through desert that killed grown men, made his hands shake as he poured water into tin cups. The girl who looked like Sarah accepted the cup but didn't drink. Instead, she knelt beside the unconscious child and dripped water carefully between her lips. The maternal gesture was so achingly familiar that Samuel had to grip the table's edge to steady himself. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "They called me Mary," she replied, the word bitter on her tongue. "But my grandmother called me Evening Star." Evening Star. Sarah had loved the evening star, had made wishes on it every night from this very window. The coincidence felt like a message from a god he'd stopped believing in 3 decades ago. "The school," he managed, his voice rough. "They'll come looking." Evening Star's jaw tightened. "Captain Stone already is. He has men, dogs. He says we're stolen property that needs returning." The unconscious girl stirred, mumbling words in a language Samuel didn't recognize. Evening Star smoothed her hair with infinite tenderness, and Samuel saw his own grief reflected in her young face, the weight of protecting something precious in a world determined to destroy it. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mesa, and Samuel realized that for the first time in 36 years, he was no longer alone with his ghosts. But as thunder rumbled in the distance, he wondered if he'd invited salvation or disaster into his sanctuary. The wind picked up, rattling the windows like someone or something trying to get in. The storm broke at midnight, lightning illuminating the 10 girls huddled in Samuel's cabin like a photograph of his deepest regrets. Rain hammered the roof with the fury of 36 years of accumulated guilt, and he found himself moving through rooms that hadn't sheltered children since Sarah's laughter died with her. He'd given them what food he had: dried beans, hardtack, strips of jerky that turned tender in their mouths after soaking in warm broth. They ate with the mechanical efficiency of creatures who'd learned hunger was a luxury they couldn't afford. The youngest, who'd finally awakened to whisper her name, was Little Fox, clung to Evening Star's dress like salvation itself. "Tell me about the school," Samuel said as thunder shook the windows. He sat across from Evening Star at the same table where he'd once helped Sarah with her letters, the irony not lost on him that he was again teaching a dark-haired girl to trust a world that had already betrayed her. Evening Star's fingers traced patterns on the worn wood, circles and lines that looked like the star charts Sarah used to draw. "Carlisle Industrial School for Indians," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They cut our hair first, said it was dirty, uncivilized, made us watch it burn." Samuel's jaw tightened. He remembered Sarah's hair, how she'd insisted he braid it every morning because "Mama showed me how and I don't want to forget." The thought of someone burning a child's hair like refuse made his hands curl into fists. "They gave us new names," continued a girl who'd introduced herself as both Margaret and Singing Bird. "Said our real names were heathen, made us forget our families' faces. Some girls stopped talking altogether. Just stopped." "How many of you were there?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Hundreds," Evening Star whispered. "Boys, too. They kept us separate. Some never came back from the punishment rooms." The cabin fell silent except for the storm's fury. Samuel stared at these children. Children, God help him, not even the oldest could be 17, and saw Sarah in each face. Sarah, who'd been 8 when she vanished from this very porch while he was mending fence in the back pasture. Sarah, whose absence had carved a hole in his chest that 36 years hadn't filled. "Captain Stone," he said carefully. "Tell me about him." Evening Star exchanged glances with the others before speaking. "He runs the school, says he's saving us from ourselves. Has pictures of dead Indian children on his wall. Says they're what happens when we resist civilization." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But there's something wrong with his eyes, like he's looking for someone who isn't there." Samuel knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for 3 decades. The storm intensified, and he moved to check the windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, he thought he saw movement near the tree line, shadows that moved too purposefully to be wind-blown branches. His blood chilled. He'd chosen this remote mesa specifically because no one came here accidentally. If someone was watching his cabin tonight, they'd come with purpose. "Girls," he said quietly, "move away from the windows." They obeyed instantly, clustering near the fireplace with the fluid coordination of creatures accustomed to hiding. Evening Star appeared at his shoulder, her young face etched with premature lines of worry. "Is it him?" she asked. Samuel peered through the darkness. Lightning flashed, and for a split second he saw them clearly. 4 men on horseback, rain-soaked but patient as carrion birds. One wore a military-style coat, despite the weather. Even from this distance, Samuel could see the man's rigid posture, the way he sat his horse like a monument to righteous purpose. "Captain Stone," Evening Star breathed, confirming his suspicions. "Why now?" Samuel muttered. "In this storm?" "He doesn't sleep much," said Little Fox, speaking for the first time since awakening. Her voice was thin as birdsong, but steady. "The girls who've been there longest say he walks the halls at night, looking into empty rooms like he's searching for ghosts." Samuel's chest tightened. He knew about searching for ghosts. The difference was, his ghost was dead. Stone's might still be breathing. Another lightning flash revealed the men had spread out surrounding the cabin. They weren't here for negotiation. Samuel's mind raced through options, none of them good. His Winchester was loaded, but 4 armed men against 1 old rancher and 10 terrified girls weren't odds he liked. "There's a root cellar," he said quietly, "behind the kitchen pantry. It connects to a cave system that leads to the eastern face of the mesa. If things go bad—" "No," Evening Star said firmly. "We've run enough. Child, this isn't about pride. It's about home." She looked around the cabin at her 9 companions who'd found the first warmth and safety they'd known in years. "You gave us something tonight, food, shelter, kindness, things we'd forgotten existed. We won't let them take that away." Samuel stared at this girl who looked so much like Sarah, who spoke with the wisdom of someone far older than her years. In her dark eyes, he saw the same stubborn spark that had made Sarah climb the tallest trees and befriend the wildest horses, despite his worried protests. Thunder crashed overhead as boots splashed through puddles outside. Samuel heard the jingle of spurs, the creak of leather, the low murmur of men preparing for violence. Captain Stone was coming, and Samuel realized that for the first time in 36 years, he had something worth fighting for. "Then we make our stand," he said, reaching for his rifle. "But I want you to know, whatever happens tonight, you've already given me more than I've had in decades. You've given me purpose." Evening Star smiled, and for a moment Samuel could almost believe Sarah had come home at last. The storm raged on, and in its fury, Samuel heard the sound of his old life ending and something new beginning. The knock came at dawn, measured and official as a death warrant. Samuel had spent the sleepless night teaching the girls how to reload his spare rifles, their small hands surprisingly steady as they learned to chamber rounds. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through storm-cleared windows, Captain Jeremiah Stone stood on his porch like judgment incarnate. "Mr. Garrett," Stone called through the door, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to obedience, "I believe you have something that belongs to the United States government." Samuel opened the door slowly, keeping his body positioned to block Stone's view of the interior. The captain was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of winter steel. Behind him, 3 deputies flanked the porch, their hands resting casually on their weapon grips. "Captain Stone, I presume?" Samuel said evenly. "Bit early for social calls, isn't it?" Stone's smile held no warmth. 10 students from Carlisle Industrial School disappeared 3 days ago. Witnesses saw them heading toward this mesa. I'm here to collect them and return them to their proper education. "And if I haven't seen any students?" "Then you won't mind if we search your property." Stone stepped closer, and Samuel caught something unsettling in the man's eyes, a desperate hunger that went beyond duty. "These children are dangerous, Mr. Garrett. Uncivilized. They've been contaminated by savage influences that proper schooling is designed to eliminate. For their own good, they need to be returned to structured care." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Seems to me a child running from school might have good reason." "You don't understand the complexities of Indian education," Stone replied, his voice gaining fervor. "These children arrive speaking heathen tongues, worshiping false gods, living like animals. We transform them into productive citizens. We save their souls." Through the slightly open door, Samuel heard the soft whisper of footsteps as the girls positioned themselves according to the plan they'd rehearsed. Evening Star would be near the kitchen window with 3 others, ready to escape through the root cellar if necessary. The remaining 6 would create a distraction from the front room, buying the others time. "That's a mighty generous way of describing kidnapping," Samuel said. Stone's facade cracked slightly. "You have no idea what these children are capable of when left to their own devices." I've seen entire families destroyed by the violence inherent in the Indian nature. My own—" He stopped abruptly, his hand moving unconsciously to a worn photograph tucked into his coat pocket. In that gesture, Samuel recognized something achingly familiar, the way a man touches a talisman of loss, the unconscious reaching for what's been torn away. Stone wasn't just a military officer following orders. He was a father haunted by ghosts. "Your own what, Captain?" Samuel pressed gently. Stone's eyes hardened. "My own experience has taught me that mercy toward savages is cruelty toward civilization. These children will be returned to proper care, Mr. Garrett, with or without your cooperation." The captain stepped back and nodded to his men. Two moved toward the barn, while the third circled toward the cabin's rear. Samuel's pulse quickened. They were being surrounded with military precision. "You know," Samuel said, raising his voice slightly, "it's interesting how a man dedicates his life to saving children by taking them from their families. Makes a person wonder what kind of family you came from, Stone." The captain's face flushed red. "You know nothing about my family." "I know the look of a man carrying ghosts," Samuel replied. "Seen it in my own mirror for 36 years. Lost my daughter when she was 8. Spent decades wondering if I could have saved her, if I'd been a better father, if I'd just been there when she needed me most." Stone's hand tightened on his weapon. "This conversation is over." "The difference between us," Samuel continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "is that I learned grief doesn't give a man the right to steal other people's children." From inside the cabin came the sound of a chair scraping against floorboards. Evening stars signaled that the girls were in position. Samuel tensed, knowing the next few minutes would determine whether these children lived free or died in captivity. Stone drew his pistol with practiced ease. "Stand aside, Mr. Garrett. I won't ask again." "And I won't ask you to leave my property again," Samuel replied, his own hand moving to his rifle. "Seems we have ourselves an impasse." The morning air grew thick with tension. In the distance, a hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the silence like a warning. Samuel thought of Sarah, wondered if she was watching from whatever place good children go when the world fails them. He hoped she'd understand why he was finally choosing to fight. "You're harboring fugitives," Stone said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Federal fugitives. That makes you an enemy of the state." "No," Samuel replied quietly. "That makes me a man with a conscience." Stone raised his weapon, and Samuel saw madness flickering in the captain's eyes, the kind of madness that comes from convincing yourself that cruelty is kindness, that destroying children saves them. It was the look of a man so broken by loss that he dedicated his life to breaking others. "Last chance, Garrett." Samuel thought of Evening Star's smile, of Little Fox's trust, of 10 children who'd found safety in his cabin after years of systematic brutality. He thought of Sarah, who'd died because he wasn't there to protect her, and knew that history would not repeat itself. Not today. "And not ever again. Come and take them," he said. The morning exploded into violence as Stone's patience finally snapped. The captain's shot splintered the doorframe inches from Samuel's head, and suddenly the peaceful dawn erupted into chaos. Samuel dove behind his overturned table as bullets shattered windows and embedded themselves in walls that hadn't heard gunfire since the Apache raids of his youth. From inside the cabin came the sounds of his plan unfolding, girls scrambling toward predetermined positions, the scrape of furniture being overturned for cover, the metallic click of rifles being cocked by hands too young to hold such weapons. Evening Star's voice rose above the gunfire, calling orders in her native tongue that somehow sounded like prayers. Samuel fired back through the broken window, not aiming to kill, but to drive Stone's men back, to buy precious seconds for the girls to escape through the root cellar. But as he chambered another round, he realized with growing dread that Stone wasn't retreating. The captain was advancing with the single-minded determination of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. This wasn't just a mission for Stone, this was redemption. And redemption, Samuel knew, was the most dangerous thing a broken man could seek. The gunfight lasted 7 minutes that stretched like hours, each second measured in heartbeats and the whistle of bullets through morning air. Samuel pressed himself against the cabin wall, reloading with hands that remembered 30-year-old cavalry training, while Stone's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You're only making this harder on them, Garrett," the captain shouted from behind an overturned water trough. "These children belong in civilization, not hiding in caves like animals." Samuel risked a glance through the shattered window and saw Evening Star crouched near the kitchen, her dark eyes fierce with determination as she helped Little Fox toward the root cellar entrance. But something was wrong. Instead of all 10 girls retreating as planned, 6 remained in the front room, armed with his spare rifles and positioned like seasoned fighters. "What are you doing?" he hissed at them. "Get to the cellar." "We don't run anymore," replied Singing Bird, her young voice steady as she took aim through a broken window. "We fight." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. These children, had been so broken by the world's cruelty that they'd rather die fighting than flee to safety. It was the saddest thing he'd ever witnessed, and the most beautiful. Stone's deputy circled toward the barn, using the morning shadows for cover. Samuel tracked him through the scope of his Winchester, fingers steady on the trigger, but couldn't bring himself to fire. The man was young, maybe 25, with the soft face of someone who'd never seen real violence. Probably had a wife waiting at home, maybe children of his own. Samuel had killed men in the war, but that was different. That was survival in uniform. This felt too much like murder. His hesitation cost him. The deputy reached the barn's corner and opened fire on the cabin's rear window, forcing Evening Star and Little Fox to dive for cover just feet from the cellar entrance. They were trapped, pinned down by crossfire with nowhere to run. "Damn it," Samuel muttered, abandoning his position to help them. But as he moved through the cabin, something caught his eye that made his blood freeze in his veins. There, clutched in Little Fox's trembling hands, was a small wooden doll with faded yellow hair and a dress sewn from flour sack material. The same doll he'd carved for Sarah 36 years ago, the one he'd searched for in the ruins of their burned wagon but never found. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the gunfire. Little Fox looked up at him with eyes too old for her young face. "My sister gave it to me before they took her away. She said our father made it, said it would keep me safe." The world tilted sideways. Samuel's vision blurred as pieces of a 36-year-old puzzle suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. The doll. Little Fox's age. The way Evening Star looked so much like Sarah it made his chest ache. The reason these particular children had found their way across 200 miles of desert to his doorstep. "What was your sister's name?" he whispered. "Evening Star," Little Fox replied simply. "But the school called her Mary." Samuel's legs nearly gave out. He stared at Evening Star, really looked at her for the first time, and saw not just a resemblance to Sarah, but Sarah herself, older, harder, marked by years of institutional brutality, but unmistakably his daughter. The scar on her forehead from when she'd fallen from her pony, the way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right after breaking her collarbone at age 6, the birthmark on her wrist that looked like a tiny star. 36 years ago, Sarah hadn't died in that Apache raid. She'd been taken, raised in captivity, eventually sent to the very school from which she'd just escaped, and Little Fox, sweet, fragile little fox, was her daughter, his granddaughter. "Oh, God," he breathed, the rifle slipping from his numb fingers. "Oh, my God." Evening Star must have seen something in his face because she went very still, her dark eyes searching his features with growing recognition. The years fell away from both of them, and Samuel saw the moment she remembered, saw his 8-year-old daughter recognize her father despite 3 decades of separation and suffering. "Papa?" she whispered, the word barely audible above Stone's continued shouting outside. The reunion he'd dreamed of for 36 years was interrupted by the crash of splintering wood as Stone's men prepared to storm the cabin, but now everything had changed. These weren't just 10 children he was protecting, this was his family. His daughter and granddaughter finally home after a lifetime of hell. "Listen to me," he said urgently, gripping Evening Star's shoulders. "The tunnel behind the cellar leads to a cave system. Follow it east for half a mile, then north until you see daylight. There's an old mine shaft that opens onto the far side of the mesa. Take Little Fox and the others. Get them to safety." "I won't leave you again," Evening Star said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Not again." "You're not leaving me," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You're saving my granddaughter. You're saving all of them. That's what families do. They protect each other." Another volley of gunfire shattered the remaining windows, and Samuel knew they were out of time. Stone was done with negotiations, done with patience. The captain was coming for his prize students, and he wouldn't leave empty-handed. "Go," Samuel urged, pushing Evening Star toward the cellar. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." But as his daughter, alive after all these years, disappeared into the darkness with Little Fox and the other girls, Samuel realized he finally understood Captain Stone's madness. The desperate hunger in the man's eyes, the obsessive need to collect these particular children. Stone had lost someone too. Someone these girls reminded him of. Someone whose absence had driven him to the very edge of sanity. The difference was, Samuel had just found his family again, and he'd die before he let anyone take them away a second time. He picked up his rifle and walked toward the front door, ready to face whatever came next. Outside, Captain Stone was shouting orders to his men, his voice rising to near hysteria as he prepared for the final assault. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the mesa where 3 generations of Garrett family were about to make their stand against a world that had already taken too much from all of them. In the distance, Samuel could hear the faint echo of children's voices disappearing into the tunnels beneath his home, the sound of hope escaping into darkness, carrying with it the promise that somewhere, somehow, love would find a way to survive even the cruelest intentions of civilized men. The battle for his family was about to begin. Samuel stepped onto his porch with the calm of a man who'd finally found something worth dying for. The morning sun painted the mesa in shades of gold and red, the same colors Sarah had loved to capture in her childhood drawings. Behind him, the cabin stood empty except for echoes of laughter that had filled it for one precious night. Captain Stone emerged from behind the water trough, his military bearing intact despite the wild desperation in his eyes. At 40 yards, Samuel could see the tremor in the captain's hands, the way his jaw worked silently as if arguing with invisible demons. This wasn't just duty anymore. This was personal vendetta, wrapped in the flag of righteous purpose. "Where are they, Garrett?" Stone called out, his voice cracking like a whip. "Those children need proper care. They need to be saved from themselves, from the savagery that runs in their blood like poison." "Funny thing about poison," Samuel replied, his rifle held loose but ready. "Sometimes the cure kills faster than the disease." Stone's face flushed red. "You have no idea what you're protecting. I've seen what happens when Indians are left to their own devices. The violence, the depravity. They killed my... His voice broke, and for a moment the military mask slipped entirely. They killed your what, Captain? My daughter, Stone whispered, the words torn from his throat like shards of glass. Emma. She was 7 years old, beautiful, innocent, full of laughter. The Apache raiding party took her from our ranch in Arizona. When we found her 3 days later, he couldn't finish, his entire body shaking with suppressed rage and grief. Samuel felt a chill of recognition. Stone wasn't just a zealot. He was a father destroyed by loss, just as Samuel had been. The difference was that Samuel's grief had turned inward, while Stone's had metastasized into a crusade against an entire race of people. I'm sorry for your loss, Samuel said quietly. But stealing other men's children won't bring Emma back. Those children in there aren't men's children, Stone screamed, his composure finally shattering. They're property of the state. Wards who need civilization beaten into them before they become murderers like the savages who raised them. One of those girls is my daughter, Samuel said, the words falling like stones into still water. Stone went very still. That's impossible. You said she died 36 years ago. I thought she had. Turned out she was taken in an Apache raid just like your Emma. Difference is, my Sarah survived, grew up in captivity, eventually ended up in your school system, and now she's come home. The revelation hit Stone like a physical blow. His weapon wavered as he stared at Samuel with growing horror. You're lying. The records show what the government wanted them to show, Samuel interrupted. How many children have passed through your schools, Stone? How many families destroyed in the name of civilization? How many fathers like us, grieving children we thought were dead? Stone's deputy shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. The young man's weapon was still raised, but his finger had moved away from the trigger. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't the simple fugitive recovery he'd been told about. Even if what you say is true, Stone said, his voice hollow, it changes nothing. Those children are contaminated by years of savage influence. They need to be purified, educated, made into proper citizens. By beating them, by cutting their hair and forbidding their language, by making them forget their own names? Samuel's voice rose with righteous anger. Is that how you honor Emma's memory, Stone? By becoming the very monster you claim to fight? The captain's face went white, then red, emotions warring across his features like storm clouds. Behind his eyes, Samuel could see the man struggling with 30 years of carefully constructed justifications, the elaborate mental architecture he'd built to make his cruelty feel like kindness. You don't understand, Stone whispered. If I don't save them, who will? If I don't civilize them, they'll become killers. They'll take other children, other Emmas. I can't let that happen. I won't. The only children being taken here are the ones you're trying to drag back to your school, Samuel replied. Look at yourself, Stone. Really look. You've become exactly what you claim to hate. For a moment, something flickered in the captain's eyes. Doubt, perhaps even recognition. But then his face hardened again, the brief crack in his certainty sealing over like scar tissue. Enough, he said, raising his pistol. You're harboring federal fugitives. Stand aside or I'll remove you by force. Samuel hefted his rifle, the familiar weight comforting in his hands. Then you'd better make your first shot count, Captain, because I guarantee it'll be your last. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, the whisper of wind through desert grass, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Somewhere beneath his feet, his daughter and granddaughter were making their way through darkness toward light, carrying with them the hope of a family reunited after decades of separation. Stone's deputy took a half-step backward, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. The third man had disappeared entirely, probably retreating to a safe distance to avoid the crossfire. They'd signed up to collect runaway students, not to engage in a gunfight with a desperate old man defending his family. "Last chance, Garrett," Stone said, his voice steady now, emptied of everything except cold purpose. "Step aside and let me collect my students. Fight me, and you'll die for nothing. Those children will end up back at the school anyway, and your noble sacrifice will be forgotten before your body cools." Samuel thought of Evening Star's smile when she'd recognized him, of Little Fox clutching Sarah's old doll, of 10 broken children who'd found safety in his cabin for one precious night. He thought of 36 years of grief and regret, of chances missed and words unspoken, of a life lived in the shadow of loss. "You're wrong about one thing, Stone," he said quietly. "It won't be for nothing. Because for the first time in 36 years, I know my daughter is alive. I know she's free. And I know she'll keep my granddaughter safe. That's worth any price." The captain's finger tightened on the trigger, and Samuel saw his own death reflected in the man's eyes, but he also saw something else, a flicker of the grief-stricken father Stone had once been, before loss had twisted him into something unrecognizable. For just a moment Samuel felt pity for the broken man who stood ready to kill him. Then gunfire erupted across the mesa, and pity became a luxury neither of them could afford. The first shot came not from Stone's pistol but from the ridgeline behind the cabin, a sharp crack that echoed across the mesa like thunder. Stone spun toward the sound, confusion replacing fury on his weathered face, just as a voice called out from the rocks above, "Federal marshals, drop your weapons!" Samuel's heart lurched. Through the morning haze, he could see the glint of rifle barrels positioned along the mesa's rim, at least 6 men in dark coats with badges gleaming on their chests. His mind raced. Had Stone called for backup? Were these reinforcements come to drag his family back to that hellish school? But something was wrong with the picture. Stone looked as stunned as Samuel felt, his pistol wavering as he stared up at the newcomers with naked bewilderment. "This is my jurisdiction," Stone shouted. "These are federal students under my authority." "Not anymore," came the reply from above. A tall man with silver hair and a marshal's badge descended the rocky slope with practiced ease, his rifle trained on Stone. "Captain Jeremiah Stone, you're under arrest for violations of the Federal Child Protection Act of 1885. Samuel blinked in surprise. He'd never heard of such an act, but the marshal spoke with the authority of absolute certainty. Behind him, 5 other lawmen took positions around the clearing, their weapons trained not on Samuel but on Stone and his remaining deputy. "This is outrageous," Stone sputtered. "I'm conducting official government business. These children are wards of the state." The lead marshal reached the bottom of the slope and approached Stone with calm determination. Up close, Samuel could see the man was older than he'd first appeared, perhaps 60. With the bearing of someone who'd spent decades enforcing justice in impossible places. "Marshal William Hayes, Indian Affairs Division," the man announced. "We've been investigating reports of abuse and illegal detention at Carlisle Industrial School for the past 6 months. Your name came up quite frequently in witness testimony." Stone's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "Testimony? From whom? Savage children who don't understand the civilizing process? Their word means nothing." "From federal inspectors who documented your methods," Hayes replied coldly. "From teachers who resigned rather than participate in your education programs. From Army doctors who treated children with injuries consistent with systematic abuse." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "This is a federal warrant for your arrest, issued 3 days ago." Samuel lowered his rifle, hardly daring to believe what he was witnessing. After 36 years of loss and grief, after one night of desperate hope followed by violent confrontation, Salvation had arrived from the most unexpected source, the very government that had created the horror in the first place. "The children," Samuel said urgently. "They're safe, but—" "We know where they are, Mr. Garrett," Marshal Hayes said kindly. "We've been tracking their movements for days. When they disappeared from Carlisle, we followed Captain Stone, knowing he'd lead us to them eventually." He gestured toward the mesa's base. "My men found the cave entrance an hour ago. The children are unharmed and waiting for you." Samuel's knees nearly buckled with relief. "All of them? All 10? Including your daughter Sarah, or Evening Star, as she prefers to be called now?" Hayes's expression softened. "She told us quite a story, Mr. Garrett. About a father who gave up everything to protect children he'd never met because he couldn't save the one he'd lost." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Through his blurred vision, he saw Stone struggling against the restraints Hayes's men had placed on him, the captain's face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You don't understand," Stone screamed. "Those children are dangerous. They need to be controlled, civilized. They're savages who'll revert to their primitive nature the moment you show them kindness." Hayes studied Stone with the cool assessment of a man who'd seen too much cruelty to be surprised by it anymore. "The only savage I see here, Captain, is a man who convinced himself that torture was education, that breaking children's spirits was somehow saving their souls." "My daughter," Stone began, his voice cracking. "Your daughter was murdered by criminals," Hayes interrupted firmly. "Not by children, not by an entire race of people. You've spent 30 years punishing innocent victims for crimes they didn't commit, trying to heal your own pain by inflicting it on others." Stone's struggles ceased, and for a moment he looked like what he truly was, a broken old man whose grief had curdled into something monstrous. Samuel felt a stab of unexpected sympathy for his would-be killer, recognizing in Stone's hollow eyes the same anguish that had driven his own 36 years of self-imposed exile. "The difference between us," Samuel said quietly, "is that my grief made me withdraw from the world. Yours made you attack it." Stone looked up at him with something that might have been recognition or regret. "I was saving them," he whispered. "I was trying to save them all." "No," Samuel replied. "You were trying to save yourself. But you can't resurrect the dead by burying the living." Marshal Hayes nodded to his men, who began leading Stone and his deputy toward horses tethered beyond the cabin. As they passed Samuel's porch, Stone stopped and looked back one final time. "What will you do with them?" he asked, and for the first time his voice held genuine concern rather than zealous certainty. "Love them," Samuel said simply. "Protect them. Let them choose their own path. Everything you should have done from the beginning." As the marshals departed with their prisoners, Samuel found himself alone on his porch for the first time in 3 days. The morning sun had climbed higher, painting the mesa in the clear light of a new day. Somewhere in the tunnels beneath his home, his daughter and granddaughter were waiting for him to come collect them and bring them home. Home. The word felt strange after 36 years of exile. This cabin had been a mausoleum, a shrine to grief and regret. But now it would be something different. A place where broken things could heal, where lost children could find safety, where an old man could finally learn what it meant to be a father and grandfather. He walked slowly toward the cave entrance, his heart hammering with anticipation and fear. What did you say to a daughter you'd lost as a child and found again as a woman? How did you bridge 36 years of separation and suffering? How did you begin to heal wounds that had festered for decades? The answer came to him as he descended into the cool darkness of the tunnels, following the sound of soft voices echoing off stone walls. You started with the truth. You started with love. You started with the simple acknowledgement that some things, family, hope, the bonds between human hearts, were stronger than time, stronger than distance, stronger than all the cruelty the world could devise. At the end of the tunnel, lit by shafts of sunlight streaming through cracks in the rock, 10 figures waited for him. Evening Star stood at their center. Little Fox clutched protectively in her arms, both of them watching him approach with eyes that held equal measures of hope and wariness. "Papa," Evening Star said softly, testing the word like a half-remembered prayer. "I'm here," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm never letting you go again." The reunion that followed would live in his memory forever. The feel of his daughter's arms around him, the weight of his granddaughter in his lap, the sound of children's laughter filling spaces that had known only silence for decades. They had work ahead of them, healing to do, a life to rebuild from the ashes of loss. But for now, in the golden light of morning streaming through ancient stone, Samuel Garrett finally understood what he'd been searching for all those lonely years on the mesa. He'd been waiting for his family to come home. 3 months later, Samuel stood on his porch watching Evening Star teach Little Fox to read from the same primer he'd used with Sarah 40 years ago. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and the last harvest from their expanded garden, where 10 pairs of hands had coaxed life from the stubborn mesa soil. The transformation had been gradual but profound. What began as a desperate refuge had become something Samuel never dared imagine. A home filled with the daily rhythms of family life. Morning chores were divided among willing hands. Evening meals stretched long with conversation in 3 languages, and nights fell soft with the sound of children's voices drifting from rooms that had stood empty for decades. "Grandfather," Little Fox called out, the words still fresh and sweet on her tongue. "Evening Star says you built this whole place with just your hands." "Is that true?" Samuel settled into the rocking chair he'd carved last month, his joints creaking in harmony with the wood. "Well, these old hands and a lot of stubbornness. Your grandmother used to say I was too proud to ask for help, even when I clearly needed it." Evening Star looked up from the primer, her dark eyes soft with an emotion Samuel was still learning to recognize. Peace. The haunted wariness that had marked her features when she first arrived had slowly given way to something resembling contentment, though he knew the healing would take years, perhaps decades. "Tell us about grandmother," she said quietly. "I remember fragments, but—" Samuel's throat tightened. He'd been avoiding this conversation, unsure how to speak of Martha to the daughter who'd lost her at age 8. But Evening Star deserved to know, and Little Fox needed to understand the woman whose blood ran in her veins. "Your grandmother had the biggest heart in Colorado territory," he began, his voice finding its rhythm in the familiar cadence of storytelling. "She could charm a rattlesnake out of biting and talk a mountain cat into sharing its den. When the Apache came through these parts, peacefully, mind you, she'd invite them to dinner and send them away with full bellies and stories to tell their grandchildren." "Is that how I learned Apache words?" Evening Star asked. Before I was taken?" "That and your natural talent for languages. You were speaking 3 tongues by the time you were 6, English, Spanish, and enough Apache to trade jokes with the children who came through with their families." Samuel's eyes crinkled with memory. "Your mother used to say you'd grow up to be a diplomat, building bridges between worlds." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Evening Star had indeed become a bridge between worlds, though not in the way Martha had envisioned. She'd survived by adapting, by learning to navigate between the culture of her birth and the harsh reality of institutional life, keeping alive just enough of herself to recognize home when she finally found it again. A rider appeared on the horizon, breaking the spell of afternoon tranquility. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that now lived within easy reach, old habits from months of vigilance. But as the figure drew closer, he recognized the silver hair and steady bearing of Marshall Hayes. "Uncle William," called Singing Bird from the garden, using the honorary title the children had bestowed on the marshal during his frequent visits. Hayes had become an unexpected ally, checking on their welfare while building the federal case against the school system that had brutalized them. Hayes dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. He accepted a cup of coffee from Quiet Waters, formerly known as Ruth, and settled onto the porch steps with the comfortable familiarity of extended family. "Good news and complicated news," he announced without preamble. "Which do you want first?" "Complicated news," Evening Star said immediately. "We've gotten good at handling complicated." Hayes nodded approvingly. The children's resilience never ceased to amaze him. "Captain Stone's trial begins next month. Federal prosecutors want testimony from anyone willing to speak about conditions at Carlisle. That includes all of you." The porch fell silent except for the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Samuel watched his daughter's face carefully, noting the way her jaw tightened and her hands clenched into fists. Testifying would mean reliving trauma, exposing wounds that had barely begun to heal. "Will our testimony matter?" asked Strong Bear, who'd chosen to reclaim his birth name rather than the Peter assigned by the school. "Or will they find ways to dismiss what we say because we're Indian children?" "Your testimony will be the foundation of the case," Hayes replied firmly. "Federal law has changed, Strong Bear. Children's rights are being recognized in ways they never were before. What happened to you? What was done to you? It matters to people in Washington who have the power to change things." "And if we don't testify?" Evening Star asked. Hayes met her gaze steadily. "Then other children might suffer what you suffered. Stone might find ways to escape justice, and the system that created these schools might continue operating." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But the choice is yours. No one will force you to relive that pain." Samuel watched his daughter struggle with the decision, saw the war between self-preservation and justice playing out across her features. At 38, she was old enough to understand the larger implications of their silence or their courage. "I'll testify," she said finally, "but not alone. We all go, or none of us go." The other children, Samuel still thought of them as children, though several were now young adults, nodded their agreement. They'd learned to move as a family unit, protecting each other through collective strength. "That brings me to the good news," Hayes said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "The federal government is offering official recognition of your family status here. Legal adoption papers for all the children, land grants to expand your holdings, and financial compensation for the years stolen from you." "Compensation?" Samuel asked, surprised. "A formal acknowledgement that the government failed these children, failed you too by taking your daughter and letting you believe she was dead for 36 years. Hayes pulled a thick envelope from his coat. "Enough to build a proper school here, maybe expand into a place where other families can reunite, other children can heal." Samuel stared at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous. Money couldn't buy back lost years or erase trauma, but it could build something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. "What do you think?" he asked Evening Star. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from the envelope to the faces of her chosen siblings, to little Fox who sat curled against her side, to the mesa landscape that had become their sanctuary. "I think Grandmother would have liked the idea of this place becoming a bridge between worlds," she said finally. "A place where broken things can be mended, where lost children can find family, where the future can be different from the past." That evening, as Samuel prepared for bed in a house that no longer echoed with emptiness, he found little Fox standing at the window of what had once been Sarah's room. She was holding the wooden doll he'd carved decades ago, its faded features worn smooth by loving hands. "Can't sleep, little one?" She shook her head, pressing closer to the glass. "Sometimes I dream about the school." about the place where they cut our hair and made us forget our names. But then I wake up here, and I remember that some dreams are just memories trying to scare us. Samuel knelt beside his granddaughter, marveling at the wisdom contained in such a young heart. Your evening star used to have nightmares too when she was about your age. I'd sit with her until she fell back asleep. Will you sit with me? Every night, if you need me to. As little Fox drifted off in the chair beside him, Samuel gazed out at the mesa bathed in moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound no longer seemed lonely. It sounded like family, like belonging, like the promise that even in the darkest wilderness, no one had to face the night alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The trial, the decisions about their future, the ongoing work of healing from trauma that ran bone deep. But tonight, in a house filled with the gentle breathing of sleeping children, Samuel Garrett finally understood what redemption looked like. It looked like love refusing to surrender to loss. It looked like hope outlasting despair. It looked like family found, chosen, and fiercely protected against a world that had tried its best to tear them apart. Outside, the desert wind sang lullabies to the stars, and for the first time in 36 years, Samuel slept without dreams of ghosts. 5 years after that first desperate night when 10 children arrived like an answer to prayers he'd forgotten how to speak, Samuel stood before a crowd of 300 people gathered on his expanded mesa property. The annual reunion gathering had grown beyond anything he'd imagined, drawing families from across the territory who'd been separated by the government school system and were slowly finding their way back to each other. Evening Star, now 43 and carrying her second child, addressed the assembly with the quiet authority she'd developed as the unofficial leader of what newspapers had dubbed Garrett's Mesa family. Her first pregnancy had been difficult. The trauma of her school years had left lasting effects on her body, but little Fox, now 13 and fierce as her mother, had helped her through with the same stubborn love that bound their entire unconventional clan together. "We gather here not to relive the pain of what was taken from us," Evening Star said, her voice carrying across the crowd without strain, "but to celebrate what we've built from the ashes of that loss. 5 years ago, my father opened his door to 10 strangers. Today, this mesa is home to 47 people who've chosen to become family." Samuel felt his chest swell with pride as he watched his daughter speak. The broken young woman who'd collapsed at his gate had transformed into something magnificent. A leader, a healer, a bridge between the world that had tried to destroy her and the future she was determined to create for her children. The crowd included faces that had become precious to him over the years. Strong Bear, now 26, had married Quiet Waters in a ceremony that blended traditions from 3 different tribes with the simple blessing of a traveling preacher who'd declared their love, "the holiest thing I've seen in 30 years of ministry." They ran the mesa's expanding agricultural operation, coaxing impossible abundance from soil that had once seemed barren. Singing Bird had discovered a gift for teaching and now operated the school they'd built with the federal compensation money. Children from the mesa and surrounding areas learned reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside traditional skills like weaving, hunting, and the preservation of languages the government schools had tried to erase. The classroom walls were covered with maps, star charts, and artwork that celebrated rather than suppressed cultural identity. But it was the newest arrivals who reminded Samuel daily of why this work mattered. Last month, Marshall Hayes had brought them a family of 4, parents and 2 young children who'd been separated for 3 years while the children endured education at a school in Oklahoma. The reunion had been heartbreaking and beautiful, the parents weeping as they held children who'd forgotten how to speak their native language, but remembered somehow the feeling of being loved. "The federal trial changed everything," Evening Star continued, her words carrying the weight of hard-won victory. Captain Stone's conviction didn't just put one broken man in prison, it opened doors for investigations across the entire school system. 7 facilities have been closed. 43 administrators have been prosecuted. And most importantly, the law now recognizes that cultural preservation is not the enemy of education. It's the foundation upon which real learning builds. Samuel thought of Stone often, more than he cared to admit. The captain had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a broken man who'd finally been forced to confront the monster his grief had created. But Hayes had told Samuel something troubling during his last visit. Stone was writing letters from prison, increasingly incoherent rambles about saving the children and completing his mission. The marshal was concerned that Stone's madness was deepening rather than healing, fed by the isolation and guilt of incarceration. A commotion near the edge of the crowd drew Samuel's attention back to the present. A rider was approaching at dangerous speed, dust billowing behind his horse as he navigated the narrow trail up the mesa. Samuel's old instincts flared. No one rode that hard unless they carried urgent news, and in his experience, urgent news was rarely good. The rider proved to be Thomas Creek, a young deputy from the nearest town who'd become friendly with their community. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been fear. "Mr. Garrett," he called out, pushing through the crowd toward the speaking platform. "I need to speak with you immediately. It's about Captain Stone." The name sent a chill through the assembled crowd. Stone had become a symbol of the institutional cruelty they'd all survived. But Samuel could see from Creek's expression that this wasn't about past wrongs. This was about present danger. Evening Star stepped aside as Samuel approached the young deputy, noting how the man's hands shook as he removed his hat in deference to the gathering. "What about Stone?" Samuel asked quietly, though his voice carried far enough for the crowd to hear. "He escaped federal custody 3 days ago," Creek said, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "Killed 2 guards during a prisoner transport. They found his trail heading west toward Colorado Territory. Toward this mesa." The crowd erupted in concerned murmurs, parents instinctively moving closer to their children. Samuel felt Evening Star's hand slip into his, her fingers cold despite the warm afternoon sun. "How is that possible?" Strong Bear demanded, stepping forward with the protective instincts of a man who'd helped build this sanctuary and wouldn't see it destroyed. "Stone's been in maximum security for 5 years. He's an old man, sick from what I heard." Creek's expression grew even more troubled. "That's the thing. He wasn't alone. 3 other escapees went with him, men who'd become devoted to his cause during his imprisonment. Guards said Stone had been preaching to other inmates about his mission to civilize the savage races, gathering followers who believed his version of righteousness." Samuel's blood ran cold. A broken, grief-mad Stone was dangerous enough, but Stone with followers, Stone with nothing left to lose, Stone driven by 5 years of festering resentment and twisted purpose, that was a threat that could destroy everything they'd built. "There's more," Creek continued reluctantly. "Before he escaped, Stone somehow got word to sympathizers on the outside. Federal marshals have been tracking increased activity among groups that oppose the government's new policies on Indian education. They think Stone might be planning something larger than just revenge against your family." Evening Star's grip on Samuel's hand tightened. Around them, the celebration atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by the grim tension of people who'd learned that safety was always temporary, that the past could reach across years to threaten the future they'd fought so hard to build. "What does Hayes recommend?" Samuel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Evacuation," Creek replied. At least for the children and families, the marshals can provide protection, but they can't guarantee safety if Stone is planning an assault with multiple armed followers. No. The word came from Little Fox, who'd moved to stand beside her mother with the fearless determination that had carried her across 200 miles of desert at age 8. "We don't run anymore. This is our home." Samuel looked at his granddaughter, barely 13, but already showing the strength that seemed to run in their family like a river of steel, and felt his heart break and soar simultaneously. She was right, of course. Running would mean abandoning everything they'd built, scattering the family they'd fought so hard to create. But staying meant risking the lives of 47 people, including children who'd already suffered more than any human should endure. "We need time to think," Evening Star said, her voice steady, despite the chaos swirling around them. "Time to plan. Time to decide what our values really mean when they're tested by the worst kind of danger." Samuel nodded, though privately he wondered if they had any time at all. Stone was coming. He could feel it in his bones like an approaching storm. The broken captain had spent 5 years in prison nursing his hatred and planning his revenge. And now, with followers and weapons and nothing left to lose, he was riding toward the mesa where Samuel's family had dared to find happiness. The celebration was over. The real test of everything they'd built was about to begin. As the crowd began to disperse, people returning to their homes to hold their families close and prepare for whatever darkness was coming, Samuel remained on the platform with Evening Star and Little Fox. 3 generations of Garretts, bound together by love and loss, and the stubborn refusal to let hatred win. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it together." "Together," Evening Star agreed. "Together," Little Fox echoed, her young voice carrying the promise of a future that refused to be destroyed by the ghosts of the past. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after Deputy Creek's warning, with the ruthless precision of a military operation planned by a man who'd spent 5 years dreaming of revenge. Samuel woke not to gunfire, but to silence, the unnatural absence of the morning sounds that had become the rhythm of his life on the mesa. No roosters crowing, no children's voices drifting from the dormitory, no clatter of breakfast preparations from the communal kitchen, just silence, thick and ominous as smoke. He dressed quickly, his 78-year-old joints protesting as he reached for the rifle that had become his constant companion since Creek's visit. Through his bedroom window, he could see figures moving in the pre-dawn darkness. Too many figures, positioned with military precision around the buildings that housed his family. Stone had come home. Samuel made his way to the main house where Evening Star lived with Little Fox and her newborn son, Samuel Jr., named for the grandfather who'd given them sanctuary when the world offered only cruelty. The baby was barely 6 months old, still dependent on his mother's milk, too young to understand that his first winter might also be his last. He found Evening Star awake and alert, the baby pressed against her chest, while Little Fox stood guard at the window with one of the hunting rifles they'd taught her to use. At 13, she was already a better shot than most grown men, but Samuel's heart ached to see a child preparing for war. "How many?" he asked quietly. "At least 20, Evening Star replied, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her dark eyes. "Stone's got them positioned in a perfect circle. No one gets in or out without going through them." Samuel's mind raced. 20 armed men against their community of 47, including children and elderly folks who'd come here seeking peace. The math was impossible, the situation hopeless, unless they could find an advantage that Stone hadn't anticipated. "Where are the others?" "Strong Bear got most of the families into the cave system before they finished surrounding us," Little Fox said, her young voice carrying the weight of premature adulthood. "But Singing Bird and Quiet Waters are trapped in the schoolhouse, and old Mr. Jensen was in the barn when they moved in." Samuel's chest tightened. Jensen was 83, a former cavalry officer who'd found his way to the mesa after losing his wife and discovering that his military pension wasn't enough to buy dignity in his declining years. The old soldier had become their unofficial watchman, but his failing eyesight and arthritic hands would make him easy prey for Stone's men. A voice echoed across the compound, amplified by the natural acoustics of the mesa's rock formations. Stone's voice, but changed, rougher, more unhinged than Samuel remembered from their confrontation 5 years ago. "Samuel Garrett," the captain called. "I know you can hear me, old man. 5 years I've waited for this moment. 5 years of planning how to finish what you interrupted. Come out, and let's settle this like civilized men." Samuel moved to the front window, careful to stay back from the glass. In the growing dawn light, he could see Stone standing on a boulder 50 yards away, close enough to talk but far enough to avoid rifle fire. The years in prison had changed him. He was thinner, grayer, with the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd fed too long on hatred and madness. But it was Stone's followers that truly worried Samuel. Young men mostly, with the hungry faces of those who'd found purpose in another man's crusade. They moved with the practiced coordination of people who'd trained together, planned together, prepared for this moment with religious devotion. "What do you want, Stone?" Samuel called back. "Justice!" Stone shouted, his voice cracking with fervor. "You harbored fugitives, corrupted children who should have been saved from their savage nature. You undid years of civilizing work with your misguided compassion. But it's not too late. Give me the children, especially that girl who claims to be your daughter, and I'll finish the work that should have been completed decades ago." Samuel felt rage surge through his chest like fire. Even now, even after 5 years in prison and a federal conviction that had exposed the brutality of his methods, Stone still believed he was the righteous one, still believed that destroying children's spirits was somehow saving their souls. "The only savage here is you, Stone," Samuel replied. "You've become exactly what you claim to fight against, a man who hurts children because his own pain demands company." Stone's laughter was a broken sound that echoed off the rock walls like the cry of a wounded animal. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about pain. This is about purpose. God gave me a mission when those heathens took my Emma, to save their children from the fate that claimed my daughter, to civilize them before they become killers themselves." "Emma wouldn't recognize the man you've become," Samuel said. The words aimed to wound because he was running out of options and time. "You've dishonored her memory with every child you've broken, every family you've destroyed." The silence that followed was more terrible than Stone's shouting. Samuel could practically feel the captain's rage building like pressure in a kettle, ready to explode into violence that would consume everything in its path. When Stone spoke again, his voice was deadly calm. "You have 1 hour to send out the children, all of them. If you refuse, we'll come in and take them, and anyone who resists will be considered an enemy combatant. This is war, Garrett, a war for the soul of civilization itself." Samuel pulled back from the window, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in tragedy. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped with no hope of outside help arriving in time. But as he looked at his daughter holding her infant son, at his granddaughter clutching a rifle with hands that should have been holding dolls, he realized that surrender wasn't an option. These children had already endured one attempt to destroy their spirits. He wouldn't let it happen again. "We fight," he said quietly. Evening Star nodded, unsurprised by his decision. "How?" Samuel thought of the cave system that honeycombed the mesa, the network of tunnels and chambers he'd explored during his 36 years of solitude. He thought of the strategic advantages the terrain offered to defenders who knew every rock and crevice. Most of all, He thought of the federal marshals who were surely tracking Stone's movements, who might arrive in time if they could hold out long enough. "We make them come to us," he said. "Use the caves, the tunnels, every advantage this mesa gives us. We turn their siege into our fortress, and we hold until help arrives." Little Fox looked up from her position at the window, her young face set with determination that reminded Samuel achingly of Sarah at the same age. "And if help doesn't come?" Samuel met his granddaughter's gaze, seeing in her dark eyes the same courage that had carried her across 200 miles of desert to find him. "Then we make sure they remember that some things are worth dying for. Family is worth dying for. Love is worth dying for. And the right of children to grow up free is worth any price we might have to pay." Outside, Stone's voice rose again in a litany of justification and rage, promising salvation through subjugation, offering civilization at the cost of souls. But inside the cabin, 3 generations of Garretts prepared to prove that some gifts, love, family, freedom, could never be taken by force, no matter how righteous the thief believed himself to be. The hour was counting down, and with it, the final test of everything they'd built on this mesa where broken things came to heal and lost souls found their way home.